Hey there guys, X's here, and in today's video we'll be taking a closer look at all of the affixes in the Mythic Plus dungeons, and I'll be sharing a few tips on how you can deal with them in the most painless possible way. If you like my videos, make sure to hit that like button and to subscribe to my channel, it will really mean a lot. And with that out of the way, let's get into the video. And to start the video off, let's talk about what affixes appear at which level. So for level 2, we only have Tyrannical and Fortified. At level 4, we have Bolstering, Sanguine, Bursting, Teeming, and Raging. And for level 7, we have Volcanic, Quaking, Skittish, Necrotic, Explosive, and Grievous. It's important to note that during each week you can only get one affix from their particular level group. So during 1 week you can only get Tyrannical, Bolstering, and Skittish, let's say. You cannot get both Tyrannical and Fortified at the same time. Now let's talk about all of the affixes, what they actually do, and how you can deal with them the easiest way. So let's start with Tyrannical, which is the first affix in the level 2 bracket. Now during the Tyrannical week, all of the bosses are going to have 40% increased HP, and they're going to deal 15% increased damage. So during this week, it's important to know all of the boss mechanics. Because they have 40% more HP and they deal 15% increased damage, it's important to do all of the mechanics correctly. Because you're gonna take a lot longer to actually kill the boss, so all of the mechanics of the boss are gonna have to be executed correctly in order for you not to wipe. Knight Captain Valier comes to mind from atal'dazar instance. During Tyrannical week, you're all gonna have to stay on top of the barrels in order for you not to wipe, because it can get out of hand pretty easily. And that's just one example that comes to mind, there are plenty others. So during Tyrannical, just make sure that you know all of the boss mechanics and that you execute them properly, and you'll have no problems at all. And next we have Fortified. Now during Fortified weeks, adds are gonna have 20% more HP and they're gonna deal 30% more damage. So during those weeks, I would definitely recommend that you set up at least some kind of an interrupt rotation for the adds, and that you also dodge everything that is dodgeable from the adds themselves. And during Fortified weeks, it's important to note that all of the adds are gonna take a lot more time for you to actually kill than the bosses themselves, so I would definitely advise you to use all of your cooldowns that you can and to just rotate them as they come up. Another thing that you can do during Fortified weeks is you can actually CC all of the adds that are CCable. Your tank is going to be grateful to you, and your healer as well. And with that said, let's move on to the affixes that appear at level 4 dungeons and above. First up we have Bolstering. Now during Bolstering weeks, non-boss enemies upon dying are gonna buff their allies in a 30-yard range radius for 20% of their HP and 20% damage. During this week, it's really important that you don't overpull packs of mobs. 4 to 6 mobs are generally gonna do it, depending on your DPS and your group capabilities. Another thing that you can do to make your life easier during Bolstering is to actually DPS all of the mobs equally, so that they all die more or less at the same time. Another good thing to do during Bolstering is to actually prioritize the targets that are quite difficult to kill or to handle, so that you don't buff them with a bunch of small and weak mobs. So to recap, just do not overpull a lot of mobs and kill them more or less equally. Do that and you won't have any issues with Bolstering at all. Now let's move on to Sanguine. Sanguine is actually considered to be one of the easier affixes to deal with, because all it does is after a mob dies, he leaves behind a pool of blood that will spread to a 5-yard radius over the next 2 seconds, and whatever mob is standing in that pool of blood is going to be healed for 5% of their maximum health each second, and any player caught in the pool itself is going to keep taking 15% of damage during his time in the pool. This affix only might be a problem in some close quarters dungeons, I don't know, Waycrest Manor or atal'dazar comes to mind. Simply because those places are packed with mobs and they have small and narrow corridors that you don't have a lot of space to move once the actual puddles start piling up. And the easiest way to deal with Sanguine is to just keep moving. Once you see the mobs are at low HP and one mob is about to die, just simply, if you're tanking them, just simply move just by a bit so that the rest of the mobs aren't standing in the puddle from the mob dying, and you're good to go. Some of the caster mobs can actually be tricky to deal with simply because they keep standing at one place and keep casting spells at the tank. And if you see a puddle underneath such a mob, just interrupt him and make sure that he moves towards the tank and that he's not standing in the puddle. And if you're still having trouble with Sanguine, just make sure that you invite a class that can either knock back the mobs or that can grip them out of the pools, and that's gonna make your life a lot easier. And moving on, we have Bursting. During Bursting weeks, mobs upon death are gonna leave a dot on all players that's gonna do damage equal to 14% of their HP over the next 4 seconds, and this dot stacks. In addition to that damage, it also deals 3.5% of the player's HP when the dot itself is applied. A lot of people actually hate Bursting, and they hate it just because they cannot mindlessly AoE. Now, the easiest way to deal with Bursting is actually not to kill a lot of mobs at the same time. Or even if you actually do kill a lot of mobs at the same time, just make sure that they die at the same exact moment. People actually wipe on Bursting not because the stacks themselves reached an unhealable amount, but because they kept reapplying the dot as it was just about to fall off. So when Bursting is active, it's really important that you DPS the mobs equally and that they all die at the same time. Because if they don't die at the same time, you're gonna end up with the dot on yourself for more than 4 seconds, and that's not gonna be easy for your healers to heal up. Also, another good thing to note is that all immunities actually drop all of your stacks of Bursting, so Cloak of Shadows, Paladin's Bubble, Ice Block, that all works, so make sure that you use them as soon as you can and to help your healers out. So for Bursting, try not to overpull. Even if you do overpull, make sure that you have at least some kind of a defensive cooldown up so that you can help your healers out, and make sure that all of the mobs die at the same time. And next up we have Teaming. Now during Teaming weeks, additional non-boss enemies are gonna spawn throughout the dungeon, and the amount of mobs required for you to kill to reach the percentage is increased. There's not really much to say about teaming, apart from that some packs might have additional mobs spawned into them that are gonna make the whole pack a bit trickier to deal with, but you can easily just CC some of the mobs in that pack and just be done with it. So just make sure to check what mobs the packs consists of and to prioritize the target accordingly. And next we have Raging. Now during Raging weeks, non-boss enemies are gonna enrage at 30% of their HP, and they're gonna deal 100% increased damage until they're defeated. The best advice that I can give you during the Raging week is that you should definitely prioritize enemies that have AoE abilities, because those tend to be particularly deadly during Raging weeks. If the pack that you're about to pull consists of a lot of mobs, make sure that you prioritize them accordingly because you don't want to enrage them all at the same time. If, however, you do enrage them all at the same time, then just make sure that you use your CCs in order for your tank to move away so that he doesn't get one-shotted by the mobs. And that wraps it up for the level 4 bracket. Now we can move on to the affixes that appear at level 7 keys and above. First up, we have Volcanic. During Volcanic weeks, when engaged in combat, enemies will periodically spawn small volcanoes that will erupt, dealing moderate damage. This is considered to be one of the easiest affixes that is currently out there, so all that you need to do to deal with this is just keep an eye out on those small volcanoes when they spawn, and when they do spawn, just make sure that you move out of them and you're good. I guess that it can get a bit tricky if you have to actually stack up, but that really shouldn't be an issue because you'll have plenty of time to move out when the actual volcanoes themselves spawn. Moving on, we have Quaking. During Quaking weeks, players will periodically quake, inflicting 20% of players' HP as damage, and interrupt spellcasting in an 8-yard radius. This one is pretty straightforward. Just make sure that when Quaking does appear that you're all spread out, not to be standing in each other's circles. And make sure that you're not casting any spells when Quaking is about to hit. If you're not sure on when Quaking is about to hit, just keep an eye out for an even smaller circle inside of your big circle. It's just gonna keep growing until it reaches the edges of the circle, and once it does reach the edges, the Quaking will explode and it will interrupt your spellcast. Moving on, we have Skittish. Now during Skittish weeks, tanks are gonna generate 75% less threat. And this affix is pretty easy to deal with. If you're gonna have a rogue or a hunter in your group, just make sure that they keep using tricks of the trade or misdirect on your tanks, and you're good to go. If you, however, do not have access to either a rogue or a hunter, then just make sure that you let your tank get some aggro onto the mobs themselves before you actually start DPSing, so that you don't over aggro your tank and that the mobs don't kill you. Next up we have Necrotic. During Necrotic weeks, all enemies' melee attacks are gonna apply a debuff that does sticking damage and that reduces healing received, and that debuff also stacks. The easiest way to deal with this is to actually AoE down mobs as soon as you can. If, however, you do not have enough DPS, then I would strongly recommend that you invite at least some classes that have some form of AoE stuns or CCs, so that if it actually does go out of hand, that you can create a gap for your tanks to move away and to let the debuff drop off. Necrotic also favors the tanks that have a lot of mobility, so that's also another thing to keep in mind when dealing with Necrotic. Next up we have Explosive. During Explosive weeks, mobs have a chance to spawn an explosive orb at a nearby location that will detonate after 6 seconds and deal 50% damage to players' health. The easiest way to deal with Explosive is to just have all of the mobs stacked up and use either a weak aura or a macro so that you can actually switch to the explosives as soon as you can. Keep in mind that AoE damage doesn't work on orbs, so that you'll actually have to hard switch to it and single target it down. So when dealing with Explosive, also make sure that you don't overpull a lot of mobs, because all of those mobs have a chance to spawn an orb and it can easily get out of hand. Next up we have Grievous. During Grievous weeks, while below 90% HP, players are afflicted with Grievous wounds. This will stack and does increasing damage until healed above 90% HP again. And the best advice that I can give you for Grievous weeks is that you should just keep an eye out on your healer's mana and you should help him out as much as you can. Pretty much every class in the game at the moment has some sort of a self-heal, so if you see that your healers are struggling, just help them out a bit by healing yourself or maybe by healing some of your group members. And lastly we have Reaping, which is a Season 2 exclusive affix and appears only in dungeons that are level 10 and above. And what does Reaping do? Well, all of the enemies that you kill leave behind a ghost with 50% of the HP of the mob's normal health. Those ghosts are gonna become active once your mob kill counter reaches 20, 40, 60, 80 or 100%. And once the ghosts are active, they start running towards you and they start attacking you. And there are 3 types of ghosts. Risen Souls, which are a melee add, and on each successful melee attack, they apply a debuff that damages players for 2% of their maximum HP, and this effect is dispellable. Next we have Tormented Souls. They cast Gravebolt, that is an interruptible 5-second cast spell that damages the player for 25% of their HP if it goes through. And lastly we have Lost Souls. They cast a frontal spell, and that spell is gonna leave behind a large purple circle on the ground. That circle can be dodged, and if players are caught in that circle, their HP is going to be reduced by 20% for 1 minute. Additionally, when Lost Souls die, they leave behind a lot of green swirlies on the ground that reduce your damage and healing by 10% per stack, and this effect lasts for 30 seconds. So the best way to deal with this is actually to have everybody stack up at the same point and to line of sight all of the mobs that are running towards you. And since those mobs don't really have a lot of HP, just make sure that once they are all stacked that you AoE them down as soon as possible and continue with your dungeon. In some of the dungeons, last wave of the Reaping mobs can actually be skipped. And to do so, just make sure that you kill the last boss in the dungeon before you actually hit 100% mark on your mob counter. And with that, we come to the end of this video. If you like what you saw, remember to hit that like button, subscribe to my channel, and I'll see you next time.